Good morning, good evening, depending on wherever in the world you are. On behalf of the Department of Law, North South University, it is my utmost pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this evening's webinar. Before I talk about the topic, let me be a little personal and let me say a few words about our today's esteemed speaker. Personally speaking, it's an utmost pleasure and honor that we have our today's speaker with us, because he's not only my former trade law teacher, he is my mentor, and perhaps I don't think any of my teachers had anywhere nearly as much influence on my academic career than our today's speaker had. So personally speaking, it's a very special webinar session for me in this particular webinar series. Now, if I talk about the topic, it's also, I guess, a very pressing topic of our time. And this is a topic that divides our opinion. But I guess it's not just a matter of trade or it's a matter of economics. It's a matter of our survival. It's a matter of our future. And I think if anything that this COVID pandemic has given us, then maybe an opportunity to rethink certain things that we do. Maybe, hopefully, the policymakers around the world would rethink certain policies that we have pursued so far. Autarky or self-sufficiency in a way may have made sense in the past, I don't know, but in the contemporary world, when it comes to food, when it comes to medicine, when it comes to certain essentials, maybe no country on the planet can have that. And if we follow economic rationale, if we go by the resources on the planet, maybe we have enough. But how do we distribute them? And how do we cling on to the policies that we profess? Sometimes in desperate times, we have taken measures which are opposed to economic sense, which are opposed to the very ethos of international trade law. So I'm sure our speaker would share his thoughts on those issues. I look forward to his talk and of course to your thoughtful questions, dear audience. Thank you all. Over to you, sir, for your speech.
Thank you, Rizwan. I hope everybody can hear me. Good evening from Singapore. Good afternoon, I guess, if you're in South Asia. And good morning for people joining us from other parts of the world. It's a great delight to join you today. Rizwan was my student in the master's course some 15 plus years ago, and then went on, of course, to become one of my first students to get a PhD and to have done very well for himself ever since. I may look young, that's mainly just because of the Zoom filter, just as my background as well is just purely a virtual library, like my erudition. But nonetheless, I hope to be able to share with you some thoughts today regarding how we should be thinking about reconstructing the world after the pandemic, what the WTO can do. For my sins, I am WTO Chair, one of many around the world, and our objective is to try to provide outreach, encourage ways to think about trade, and how the WTO could play a role in improving the lots of countries around the world. Now, today, we face a severe problem. And let me share with you now my screen, and we'll go along as we see fit. It'll be about 30, 35 minutes maximum, and then we'll open for questions. So I titled my talk today From Self-Sufficiency to Collective Security, because I see us moving in two directions. One, because all of us are self-interested and selfish people, the normal reaction to any crisis is to look only after ourselves. Yet at the same time, inside all of us is the intelligence to understand that there is something called collective self-interest, enlightened self-interest, the ability to think that a group and contributing to a group may be more effective for ourselves than just looking out only for ourselves. And we have seen this during the pandemic. And unfortunately, now we also see this very clearly highlighted in the current crisis between Ukraine and Russia. So how should we think about all of this? How does the COVID pandemic focus our minds towards reshaping how we think about trade in vaccines, medicine, other essentials like food? And I will bring you through some of my thoughts based upon my experience creating a collective food security network for ASEAN, and then using that as a springboard for discussion about how it deals with the vaccines, and then more generally thinking about what other essentials we should think about, including dealing with climate change and technology in the years to come towards the end of the talk. And that is what I will be sharing today. So we have scarcity during the pandemic. That's clear, without a doubt. There was a lot of things that were lacking. Early in the pandemic, many people stockpiled toilet paper, if you can remember, and people fought over toilet paper. Of course, not just goods, but information, true information, fake news, vaccines, now that we have them, therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies, and 2, antiviral, which recently have become quite important in our fight against this pandemic, Paxlovid done by Pfizer, and Molnupiravir done by Merck. At the same time, food prices have gone up very significantly and aggravated recently by the Ukraine-Russia conflict. At the same time, our global value chains have proved not to be as resilient because they were meant to be as efficient as possible. And whenever you do efficiency, you don't build in necessarily enough resilience. How should we then react? Well, if you believe in scarcity, then your immediate response is we go towards self-sufficiency. We look out for ourselves. We form ever smaller units, countries, villages, families, even individuals. And this could be even multilaterally agreed. So it's not necessarily autarkic. You can all agree to be self-sufficient. But is that the best response? You can also, like the reaction of President Donald Trump, move towards autarky and unilateralism, whereby you don't even get the multilateral agreement. You just do things on your own, and you end up hoarding, accusing other people of doing wrongs, and increasing the opportunities for conflict. That could be one response. And indeed, we saw a lot of this in the early days of the pandemic, with the stockpiling of various goods and items. Indeed, we face scarcity. This is without a doubt. When we look at wheat, for example, wheat prices since the pandemic have almost doubled, and the Ukraine-Russia conflict is not helping in any way. So we clearly have a scarcity issue. Despite this, I believe there are ways of dealing with the scarcity which doesn't require us to move towards being self-interested and selfish without taking into account how we as a community can come together to deal with things. So I think about an abundance mentality. I know it's not very fashionable to quote self-help gurus like Stephen Covey, the author of 7 Habits. But I do think that it is a good way to think about things. Many corporations think about it in this way. And indeed, increasingly, as some of these ideas filter their way through the system, even though it's not empirically provable that it is a better way to think about it. Academia, we think about altruism and virtue instead. I do think moving away from a scarcity mentality towards an abundance mentality, to be more people-centered, will indeed help us develop a better system for the global economy and the global structure of things in the years to come. Indeed, I wrote about this some time ago, in 2015, after I was invited to set up the regional rice agreement for ASEAN plus 3. The 3 countries were Korea, Japan, and China, all major rice-eating and rice-growing countries. And we set up a system, which I'll talk about later, to deal with the rice crisis of 2008. And indeed, I'm glad to have note, though I'm not certain of the causation, I like to think that I contributed to it a little bit, that indeed, despite around the world food prices going up everywhere, rice actually has not. Rice indeed actually, despite it being a fairly thinly traded commodity, despite it being the greatest price increase in 2008, has not seen that increase. And I think that what we set up in 2012 contributed to this a little bit. And I will explain that a little bit later. So what I'm suggesting is that looking at this would help us think about how we could set up systems using trade rules in a way that would actually ensure that things become better. Now let's think about food security first before I go into that. This is one definition of food security: when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. This is WHO's, World Health Organization's, definition of food security. And I think that's the correct one, because just because you have a lot of food doesn't mean that you have good distribution of that food. It doesn't mean that the food is easily accessible and cheap enough for people to access. Now, I'd like you to think, which country around the world do you think was the most food secure in 2019? Just think about it. No need to give me answers. Give you a couple of minutes. You would immediately, I guess, think about countries which have huge wheat fields, agricultural land, good technology, a lot of money, fertilizer, able to grow a lot of crops. It would, however, surprise you that the country with the most food security in 2019, just prior to the pandemic, according to the Global Food Security Index, was Singapore. We don't produce anything, or hardly anything. The reason for it is that, as Rizwan will know, and any of you who have visited Singapore, we're only 720 square kilometers, 5.5 million people. With that kind of population density, lacking rainwater, we can't really grow very much. We do grow a little bit of mushrooms. We grow a certain number of people, and that's about it. We are trying to improve it because in 2021, we dropped to 15th because a lack of resilience was exposed by the pandemic. What happened was that when the borders started shutting, all our food which comes from outside Singapore started having problems coming in. Our chicken, our eggs, our vegetables come from Malaysia and Indonesia. But when they started shutting the borders, we couldn't get it. We had to fly in food from New Zealand and Poland. Fortunately, we do have a certain amount of affluence to be able to afford to fly in eggs, chicken, and other foods from New Zealand and Poland. But it was a shock to the system. Now, such a shock to the system could suggest that we respond by being protectionistic, by being self-sufficient, by moving towards hoarding rather than sharing. But that was not the response that Singapore did. We had a different mindset, maybe one I could define as an abundance mindset. And this is from the recent Singapore Food Authority website. We said that the 2021 pandemic further amplified the gravity of safeguarding food security. And indeed, we have been actively planning for long-term food security through what they call the 3 food baskets: diversifying food, growing food overseas, and making us resilient. So how do we do that? You increase multiple channels of trade in food rather than to block off trade. We also increase production, and we know we can't produce too much in Singapore. There are limited. However, what we can do is to produce it overseas and provide overseas countries with capital and technology to produce more food. We can also increase reliance and resilience in Singapore by producing some amount of goods, hydroponic, eggs, as well as stockpiling to ensure that we deal with sudden crises. So this is not something that would resolve everything on a long-term basis. So we think about creative solutions rather than what our gut feel selfish answers. And this is clear when we think about what people thought about the food crisis in the past. Now, way back about 200 years ago, a gentleman called Thomas Malthus just did a geometric progression of the population and assumed that production of food would be arithmetic. And therefore, he's assumed that at some point in time, the population would outstrip the ability of the world to produce enough food. And this was a Malthusian point after which people would starve. But we never really got to this. Why? Because even though the population is indeed geometric, over time, birth control, more education resulted in slowing down of the population. At the same time, technology, greater creativity, better use of resources resulted in better production of food. So this is a current projection that there will be indeed more than enough food in the future rather than less. However, just because there is more doesn't mean that it's equally distributed and doesn't mean that everybody will not go hungry. Production is often not the problem. It is distributing the capital for the production and distributing the products of that production. And that becomes the big problem. And one which actually the WTO is indeed uniquely positioned and has expertise to try to help. Now, when we think about climate change, we think about the fact that it's going to affect food production around the world. Indeed, for many of us, it will affect us quite severely. But just because it affects certain countries quite badly, it doesn't mean that production around the world will indeed, on aggregate, drop. There will be some winners. There will be some possible increases of yield, particularly in the colder countries, or colder now, later on warmer. And in those areas, you will see increases in yield. The question is whether or not we are able to distribute resources, obtain food from those countries, and change the way we grow, the way we trade, and the way we distribute food to cope with this current crisis. So even with climate change, we should be able to produce enough. But will our population production adapt? Will we distribute the food equitably? The problem we face is wrong policies. Many countries still have a mercantilist perception that indeed what they think about is that if I become rich and you become poor, I am stronger for it. Indeed, something like this is something that Mr. Putin, President Putin, thinks about when he thinks about how to structure his country and the current crisis in Ukraine. This would result, therefore, in protectionism, import substitution, bad subsidies, trade wars, in fact, even actually real wars. This self-sufficiency is something we should resist. It is based upon either vested interest or actually stupidity. It does not work. You can see this in the Saudi wheat production system. The Saudi Arabia decided that they want to be self-sufficient for food. And now this is a country which has huge amount of financial resources, and therefore they poured all that financial resources in to grow enough wheat for themselves. But as many of you will know, even though they have a lot of money, a lot of oil, a lot of energy, and could hire the best people, they do lack one thing: water. And therefore, because of that, no matter how much they ramped up production, they could never be self-sufficient because water was always the problem. They dried up the aquifers. They now have a problem environmentally that they don't have enough water even for own drinking because of the usage of those aquifers towards the production of wheat. They could never achieve self-sufficiency, and it became a problem. So this highlights the idea that self-sufficiency, just by itself, without considering your circumstances, could be either stupid or could be because you have vested interests, people who want to benefit from such a bad policy through subsidies, through grants from the government towards themselves. It has to be very carefully managed. At the same time, whenever you have a crisis, people could react with a great deal of selfishness. And we saw this with a rice crisis of 2008, which some of you may remember. In 1 month, the price of rice rose from 250 metric ton to about $1,000 per metric ton, 4 times increase. Now, some of this was because bad weather affected rice harbors, but that was just a trigger. The reactions of rice-producing countries made a difficult situation worse. The trigger point was when India imposed export restrictions on rice, except for basmati. And when China and Thailand were reported to be considering it, because rice is a thinly traded commodity, the potential export restrictions imposed by some of the largest producers led to a scramble by individual countries to secure for themselves what is the major staple food for the region, which ended up with Philippines then buying rice at $1,000 per metric ton, which then resulted in price of rice rising very high, causing a lot of people to go into poverty and to have a certain amount of food insecurity. Now, soon after this, the UN reporter from the Right to Food, Mr. Oliver De Schutter, argued that the WTO trade disciplines overly restricted WTO members' domestic policies and prevented them from ensuring food security for their citizens by limiting subsidies and preventing them from privileging domestic production, subsidizing domestic production. As I just showed you, it doesn't always work. Just because you want to benefit your domestic production, it may not be the most effective way for you to have food security. Mr. Oliver De Schutter argued that the right to food should prevail over the WTO. But then WTO Director General Pascal Lamy responded that this was not the case, as there was enough flexibility in the WTO disciplines, indeed there are, to provide policy space, and that indeed, rather than to think about trade as being a factor in the problem, trade was actually a solution to a limited food supply, as we've seen from the Singapore example. What we have is basically a collective action problem, played out not just in our arbitrary geographical boundaries or borders, but on a planetary scale across the entire global commons. Famine, drought, weather, climate change does not respect boundaries. Neither does the pandemic. So, how should we draw lessons from all of this? Well, I was invited soon after to the ASEAN Plus 3 Emergency Rice Reserve Committee, where we're thinking about how to set up a rice reserve. They were having an impasse in the negotiation, and the Asian Development Bank asked me to act as legal counsel to resolve the deadlock. Now, essentially, some members wanted the rice reserve to only include rice from outside of Asia, arguing that if you wanted to ensure security in Asia, then you need to have rice coming from outside Asia coming into the stockpile. Others argued that this was not a supply side problem, but rather a production side problem, and therefore wanted the rice to only come from Asia. Now, while this seems on the surface to make sense, really what was at stake was that some APTIA members wanted to use their obligatory rice purchase stockpiles from the US, EU, and Australia because they didn't open up their markets for rice and therefore have to buy it as an obligatory rice purchase to distribute as food. Other members who are producing a lot of rice wanted to be able to subsidize their farmers and to give the farmers benefits so that they would vote for them in the next elections. Now, as all APTIA members were WTO members, I was able to tell them that our origin non-neutral rice policy would be in breach of their WTO obligations, and that even though there is flexibility in the WTO, GATT Article 20 will not excuse a breach unless they could clearly show why the origin of rice was necessary. And I could not see actually how the origin of rice, whether outside of Asia or within Asia, could be justified. And I was glad that he eventually accepted my opinion. So therefore, they decided that it would be origin neutral. Another APTIA issue was the price of rice. Some APTIA members wanted to fix a price. The argument was that it was meant to deal with sudden rice spikes, and therefore a fixed price would prevent this. I argued that a fixed price would be problematic because it would either act as a subsidy if the actual price of rice was below that price, or act as a disincentive to produce rice if the actual price of rice was higher than that and they could only sell at that price. Therefore, I suggested that instead, while we want to smooth out the spikes, we could do it with a series of future contracts to forecast shortfalls, fix the price based on a floating average of monthly price of rice, therefore smoothing out the spikes, but allowing it to reflect the market prices. This will not prevent increases in the price, but will soften the effect of sudden increases. And again, this was accepted. This, of course, also required the creation of monitoring and information sharing and forecasting system. And members need to tell other members what they predicted their demand and supply to be, and to stand ready to work together to alleviate production shortfalls in certain countries. And this was to be done by economists in Bangkok and Manila, with the headquarters of APTIA in Bangkok. Indeed, this was done, and I'll show you later the benefits of some of this. Finally, this will also require members to agree to work together to meet demand from their population. The 2008 crisis was triggered by export restrictions or the threat of export restrictions, creating a scenario where speculators, sensing opportunity, engage in profiteering. Now, speculation is not the cause, but it did make things worse. Now, no country in the event of a rice shortage should ever fear that they will not have enough to feed their people. But some countries will have more, and some countries will have less. It all depends on production and stockpiling. I agreed that you couldn't ask them to commit to no export restrictions, but we were able to encourage a minimum amount of rice that was agreed upon to be exported, what we call the limit export restrictions, so that you would contribute a threshold amount in case some countries need it. So every country in APTIA has to commit a minimum amount of rice to be part of a virtual rice reserve, and any country can call on it from time to time. Indeed, despite everything else going up in price during this pandemic, rice seems to have fallen a little bit in price because they were able to predict production. They were able to create a system which disincentivized speculation, and countries can share in the region for this product, which is very important for many of us. Indeed, production has increased, and the price hasn't gone up. This indeed allows us to deal with this crisis, and Bloomberg suggests that actually rice is preventing the crisis in other food products from getting worse as people move away from feeding the cattle with wheat or corn towards rice. So how do we apply this to the pandemic? Well, I think we need to resist export restrictions of vaccine equipment and essentials. We need to increase information sharing and transparency. We need to create coordination mechanisms. And through all of this, also increase production capabilities, perhaps through the transfer of technology. Basically, we need to reduce barriers. Now, unfortunately, President Trump's administration did probably almost everything wrong. First thing he did was to limit information. Second thing he did was to move towards autarky or unilateralism. Third thing he did was impose export restrictions on vaccines and vaccine production and vaccine machines. He also refused to discuss a trip waiver and imposed inconsistent travel restrictions, as some of you will remember. Now, the Biden administration, coming in the middle of the crisis, was understandably a little bit slow to respond. But it finally recognized that no one was safe unless everybody was safe. Because as we saw, COVID variants can arise at any particular time. And because they arise at any particular time and do not respect geographical boundaries, even the strictest of quarantines, no one is safe unless everybody is safe. In May 2021, we saw the terrible toll that the Delta variant took on South Asia. It was a terrible situation, and one that needed collective action by the global community, which was unfortunately very slow. This also highlighted the gaps in the current global cooperative infrastructure. And even though Singapore, Fortress Singapore, almost eliminated any COVID within our country using a COVID zero policy between January 2021 and April 2021, no country is an island, a fortress entire to itself, not even Singapore. By May 2021, because of Delta, we had an increase in community infections because some cases broke through our vaccinated frontline, our strict testing regimes, and even our mandatory, enforced, policed, you go to jail if you break them, 14 days quarantine imposed at our borders. The Delta variant didn't care about all of this. This made us move towards endemic COVID policy. And we realized that just as Singapore could not ever be self-sufficient for food, Singapore could not just concern itself with the pandemic within its borders, because this virus does not respect such arbitrary borders. We therefore need better systems to coordinate our efforts for collective measures. Therefore, the Biden administration, though slow, eventually lifted export restrictions in response to Delta by exporting vaccine equipment to India, allowing more vaccines to produce around the world, encouraging a discussion about trips, committed and indeed did donate vaccines to Gavi's COVAX policy so that more vaccines were available, and took a more multilateral leadership effort. This was good. But now you can see how a system like the rice reserves pre-agreed minimum export guarantees and centralized data monitoring and predictive alerts could have responded to the pandemic crisis in South Asia much faster. If the WTO could act as a rule-creating and data-disseminating trading hub, many lives around the world could be saved and fewer deadly variants could have been prevented from being able to mutate and spread. Rather than only thinking about the situation within our borders, the recognition that every bell that tolls for each one of us means we need to restructure our trading system around collective action on existential global issues like this pandemic and in the future climate change. But let us not forget the value of a rule-based system. We do have a rule-based system to prevent interest-captured policies from being greenwashed, from being health-washed. The WTO rules and dispute settlement system create a transparent system that requires members to rationally justify measures and to cooperate in good faith based on understanding and trust of such transparency and rationality. It is not perfect, but what is? Now, we all have reservations about the TRIPS agreement, but it's also important to bear in mind that without a guarantee of IP protection, it would have been difficult to mobilize the capital and resources needed to create the vaccines and the therapeutics in such a short space of time. Now, we know that very early on, once the vaccines were invented, on 2nd October, India and South Africa already raised the issue of an IP waiver for the vaccines in the WTO. It's currently being discussed in the WTO, and I'll talk about that very shortly. But this actually requires a less urgent response with regards to the vaccines, because some of the vaccines can already be manufactured around the world by different pharmacies and pharmaceutical factories. And the ones that most of people are talking about, the mRNA ones, actually cannot be affected and manufactured because of the higher technology and need of technology transfer, as well as setting up of specialized factories to create them. Now, for the therapeutics, good news, however. Unit 8, a branch of the United Nations, has something called a medical patent pool. And using this medical patent pool, they have signed agreement with Merck, as well as working towards one with Pfizer for Paxlovid and Molnupiravir, to produce generic versions of these drugs to be distributed in more than 105 developing countries. Indeed, one of the companies which is involved in this is Big Simco, a Bangladesh-based company, which indeed actually would not even need MPP to distribute it among Bangladesh, as well as other LDCs, because there is already a waiver or carve-out in the TRIPS agreement, Article 66, for LDC countries. Indeed, Simco was prepared to use this waiver if the MPP didn't come true. But because MPP came true, it can now distribute not just to LDCs, but all 105 developing countries. And indeed, this is being done. So this is something that's being done within the current framework of the TRIPS agreement, allowing the pharma companies to have some financial incentive, while yet ensuring a certain amount of equitable distribution among those countries which can less afford the cost of some of these expensive drugs. Now, not all vaccines will also be useful to all countries. The mRNA vaccines, for example, require very low temperature storage. And not all the vaccines, as I said before, are able to be currently manufactured. So we should think about how we can move around certain technologies and factories. But a discussion was needed and is still needed. We need a collaborative spirit and mechanism for it. And I do think the WTO, WHO, World Bank, and the UN can play a role in this regard. In the WTO, this is the latest development. The WTO Council of Trade hasn't been able to agree on two proposals, but they have kept it open, and they recently elected a LDC chair of the council, the ambassador from Sierra Leone. What are these two proposals? Well, the African group, as well as other countries, including the LDC group, which Bangladesh is part of, wanted to have a blanket waiver for anything which could be used towards prevention, treatment, or containment of COVID. And this should be enforced for 3 years. One problem with this proposal, though I am supportive of it in principle, is that it is very broad. Anything could be defined in this regard. And because anything could be defined as being relating to the prevention, treatment, and containment of COVID, some countries are understandably reluctant to undermine the financial incentives for their pharmaceutical industries. The EU, which is a major producer of pharmaceuticals, has a draft declaration alternative where basically what they have provided is a quicker way of using the compulsory license regime, which already existed in the WTO and which has been used for the AIDS drugs in South Africa and Rwanda, for example. Now, the problem with this one is that it perhaps is a little bit too little and a little bit too late. And there's a great need to meet in between, and I suspect discussion, clarity about what drugs we are talking about, as well as shorter timeframes to deal with this pandemic probably is needed. Now, let's think about this, about the world ahead, where the pandemic eventually becomes endemic. Less important, we move to our next crisis, that of climate change. Joseph Stiglitz, the well-known public intellectual, Nobel laureate, says that we should use this moment to create our new world, which is marked by greater equality, social justice, green industry, and a knowledge-based economy. And I do think that this is something we need to think about. How do we create one where there is, for global issues that affect the global commons, common approaches, equitable approaches, sharing on how this technology can help us? I think we need to start off with the idea that no man is island, no country is an island entitled to itself, that indeed scarcity can be caused by a lack of imagination or industry or both. Cooperation and coordination helps. Movement away from self-sufficiency, movement towards collective security. We can do better, and indeed we should do it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your excellent presentation. We have a couple of questions already, so let me put them to you. The first question is on the transfer of technologies, that there has been enough emphasis on the donation of vaccines and other essentials. But what about the transfer of technology? Has it happened enough? And how can the WTO laws facilitate such transfer?
Unmute myself. Let me share the screen. And there we go. So I can't see this. Why can't you see this? Let me see. New share. Okay. I think I've lost the technology myself to share. But let me talk a little bit about Article 66 of the TRIPS agreement. Article 66 of the TRIPS agreement specifically provides that there is a encouragement, though not necessarily an obligation, that developed country members shall provide incentives to enterprises and institutions in the territory for the purpose of promoting and encouraging technology transfers to least developed country members in order to enable them to create a sound and viable technology base. Now note, like most special and differentiated treatment obligations, they aren't obligations. This is just encouragement, incentivization, a hortatory statement, something we wish you could do, but we're not asking you compulsorily to do. I think it has two problems. One, as I said before, if we made it compulsory, you have a problem that, one, very few countries will be incentivized, very few pharmacies, pharmaceutical industries will be incentivized to create very expensive costing technology like the vaccines if you have to transfer that technology to someone else. We need to provide some basis for them to be remunerated. And that's why we have the compulsory licensing regime. Yet at the same time, at some level, we do need to encourage them where possible to transfer that technology. So the Johnson & Johnson one, for example, the AstraZeneca one, they indeed have transfer technology, and the technology is not that difficult. This is the traditional vaccine technology. The mRNA has been a little bit more difficult. And what actually has happened is that in certain countries, including South Africa and Singapore, the companies which created the mRNA vaccine have created extra factories transferring the technology there, but protecting that transfer technology through IP rights. Can we do more? I think what we need to do is not prejudge the issue. It is difficult to imagine every single situation a rule for it, but to create forums for discussion, to create transparency about that discussion so that better solutions are found rather than a one-size-fits-all solution. Though I do again repeat that, particularly of Bangladesh, TRIPS Article 66, paragraph 2, is something you can go around telling developed countries that they have at least moral obligation to do. And, moral obligations are not ineffective. You can get them to do something about it. All right. Next question.
Thank you. The next question is, it's a long question, so I'm just taking a part of it. It's asking us that what should developing countries do if they want to receive equipment first and earlier? What is the primary key to promoting trade between developed and developing countries? This is from Dewan Fahmid. He's one of our students.
That's a very good question. Like all trade, it must be based upon enlightened self-interest. Unfortunately, Mr. Donald Trump can only see very short-term self-interest, and his self-interest is largely himself. So that was never going to work with him anyway. With other developing countries, as we've seen with the Biden administration, we saw an immediate call to action once the Delta variant came out towards export of the vaccines, export of vaccine-producing equipment, donations, well about, I think, $1 billion worth of donations of vaccines to the Gavi COVAX program to be distributed in many developing countries. Singapore has also contributed to that. You need to find a way to enunciate that enlightened self-interest. So, for example, we found it during this pandemic. because of Delta. No one is safe unless everybody is safe. It's enlightened self-interest. We could say the same thing regarding climate change. We will all face climate change. You cannot prevent climate change and say it will only occur in Bangladesh, or it will only occur in America, or it will only occur in Singapore. We have, by definition, a global climate. And therefore, if we do not find ways to share the technology to mitigate climate change, to lower carbon emission, we have a problem. And by enunciating the self-interest, at least on a long-term basis, of such sharing and the need for such collective security, through discussions, through forums, not the most sexy or fastest thing to do, I do think we reach better solutions than the current situation where either one side accuses the other side of not doing enough, or the other side just ignores all issues. Ultimately, the only way we can work collectively is if we discuss together.
Thank you. The next question that we have is on generic medicine, that some scholars from the global West, they tend to argue that if you relax the laws on generic medicine or you allow TRIPS waiver too liberally, there are also questions about quality and safety of medicine. Do you buy that argument? And if you do, then what are your recommendations?
I think such arguments in some ways are unfair. We've seen, even in the West, badly produced goods, badly produced drugs, and it can happen there just as it can happen in any other country. The way to deal with any of these situations really is having better testing, better regulatory policies, and it's for each country to ensure that in their production side, enforcement of good production occurs, and in their supply side, that they test regularly to ensure that the products are indeed safe for use or efficacious. I don't think developing countries are per se any more or less likely to produce bad drugs. India is the developing country and is indeed the generic drug factory of the world. There is incentive for India to ensure that their generic drugs are good. Otherwise, it undermines the industry. Reputation counts. I have no problem taking Indian drugs. We've seen, however, certain drug makers in the West, Purdue Pharma, for example, prioritize profits over people. And this could occur anywhere around the world, not just related to the West. And we just need to have better domestic as well as international regulations regarding that. So anybody who makes an argument trying to argue that developed versus developing is a proxy for quality, I think is unfair. Quality is quality.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that answer. The next question is on your experience as a person directly involved in the ASEAN Regional Rice Agreement. So you seem to have suggested that the policymakers ultimately listened to the law-based, policy-based advice that were offered to them. So what about some democracies where sometimes clearly illegal or mercantilist policies are pursued are the policymakers failing to do enough? Let's say if we talk about the Trump administration or some others in the West or countries where perhaps there is democracy, but we can see policies which make bare economic sense.
All countries, as I said before, as all humans as well, are both selfish as well as at the same time potentially altruistic. I'm a selfish man, but I also hope that I have some altruism in my outlook. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that I'm intelligent enough to also recognize the ability for certain policies to have enlightened self-interest. So as I said before, the role of academic is to just highlight things. I highlighted them, the need to obey WTO rules. And because these were mainly East Asian economies, very dependent on trade, they weren't going to break WTO rules easily. If it's important enough, we will, they will, but it wasn't something that they would be willing to do just to benefit a small group of rice farmers. And if they would say, look, are you putting your ability to trade with the world versus this? To say, well, enlightened self-interest, even though I want to do this, we are rule abiding. The WTO rules helped us. We will continue the rules. So it all is about highlighting what is important, what the costs are, what the benefits are. And then at the end of the day, each policymaker, each elected or appointed leader decides what they want to do. The only thing I could do was to say, this is how I see it. This is my expert opinion. You choose. But if you want me to sign off an agreement to say it's WTO compliant, I cannot do that unless you make these amendments. And as academics, as lawyers, we just have to be true to that. We can't play politics. And we've seen recently with regards to Mr. Donald Trump's lawyers, with regards to the potential scheme or plan to overturn the elections, are all now being called accountable for playing politics. As academics, as lawyers, the only thing we can do is be true to the law.
Thank you for that answer. We still have quite a few questions, but I know our time is running out.
We could collect a few and I'll answer them together.
Sure. So I'll just ask two questions together, and these two will be the last questions. So the first one is on export restrictions. In general, has the WTO law done enough to control the export restrictions? Because the focus generally has been on import restrictions. And the other, from another student, from Mohammad Taslim Bhuiya Prantik, he has asked, what measures can be taken to promote further investment in vaccine development, particularly in developing and least developed countries? So those two would be last questions for this webinar.
Well, let me answer the second question first, which is a little bit easier. One, vaccine development, IP rights, providing incentive and financially could be one way. You can also do it like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whereby they actually give grants for people to develop the vaccines. And we do need countries as well as hopefully benign billionaires, I don't know how many exist, to do those grants. And that helps. But I think one bottleneck for many developing as well as least developed countries regarding the creation of vaccines is really expertise. Now, we do have some people, and I know in Bangladesh, for example, who are very good already in Bangladesh and Bangladeshi, as well as people from the West or other developing countries, developed countries, moving to some countries to help develop those vaccines. And that's good. As I said, we all are altruistic to some extent, and some people will do that. But at the end of the day, a lot of drug trials, vaccine trials cost money. And because they cost money, you need to write a system for that money to at least be recouped, even if it's donations from billionaires, because there will be a limit to how much of that will be done. IP does it some way, government funding does it some way, but we do need to think about the financial sides. And unfortunately, even though I may be considered to be a socialist capitalist, meaning that I believe in making sure we have equitable distribution, but that I believe capitalism does produce more goods for us to be able to distribute. And our big problem is equitable distribution. In those, I think the current system can be tweaked, can be improved, but not thrown out with the bathwater. And that should provide enough financial system and incentives to reduce, as well as continue to test these goods and pharmaceutical products. Now, regards to the first question, repeat to me the first question. I'm trying to remember it.
It's about WTO law doing or not doing enough to control export restrictions.
Right.
Because
there is very clear WTO disciplines on export restrictions on goods. For example, Article 11 is a well-known one within the GATT, which prevents you from having both import restriction prohibitions as well as export restrictions unless it is deal with shortfall of products, or you can justify the measure as a measure which is necessary under Article 20, the general exceptions, to protect human, animal, plant, life, or health, or relating to exhaustible supply of natural resources, so long as you do it in conjunction with domestic policies to reduce your consumption as well. So there are cases on this, quite a few cases. I think there are at least 10 to 15 WTO cases dealing specifically with export restrictions, the most famous being the China raw material case, as well as China rare earths cases. In fact, for some of you who may be indeed taking part in the WTO moots, this is indeed the WTO moot question that's currently going on. Is it enough? I think the current disciplines are enough, because we also must remember that if we were to lock the door too tight, then we face a problem which Mr. Oliver De Schutter, the UN Special Reporter on Food Security, highlights, that we would be placing WTO rules before the need for food security. All good rules have a certain amount of flexibility built in. And if you don't have that flexibility built in, then a rule becomes unjust. You need to have justice always tempered with mercy. But let's not forget, you cannot have mercy without having a baseline of justice first, because otherwise then anything goes. So I do think that when interpreted in those cases, including the China rare earths cases, as well as raw material cases, I'm comfortable with where the line is drawn currently. Now, of course, the very fact that you have this WTO moot question suggests to me that you can always come up with new ways to game the system. But that's what lawyers do. Lawyers learn a rule, and some other lawyers find new ways to try to get around that rule, and other lawyers learn ways to argue that that's not permitted. And if not for that, we wouldn't exist and we wouldn't make any money. So it is an imperfect system. The best system would be where we are purely operating in good faith with each other, in ultimate trust. But until we get that system, the legal system, the rationality, the transparency which it requires, is a second best system that helps us move towards better understanding and better trust. And I think that's the most we can hope for. at this current time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for your excellent talk and for all the answers.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be able to share with you. It is actually a difficult time for all of us, but being able to share with students, the next generation, gives me hope. Unfortunately, you will have to do a lot of the heavy lifting because the world will need a lot of work in the years to come. So good luck. God bless. We need you.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.